Today, Australian housing is broken. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today I wanted to go into some more detail with regard to the latest census data which came out a few weeks ago, because there are some very concerning trends in the data. Indeed, the proportion of Australians who own their home outright has halved over 2 decades for most age groups, while the proportion of people with mortgages in retirement has tripled. Data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics shows that outright home ownership has halved for the 25 to 54-year-olds between 2001 and 2021. And at the same time, the number of mortgage holders and renters across all age groups have ballooned. The number of Australians who own their homes outright has dropped over the last 20 years, and the proportion of Australians who completely own their property has fallen by 11%, according to the latest census data. Now, that was based on 25,422,788 responses, and it showed that the proportion of Australians who own their home outright dropped from 41.6% in 1996 to 31% in 2021. And the same data also noted that over the last 25 years, the number of Australians who owned a home with a mortgage has also doubled, rising by 96.8%. Households that owned a mortgage property rose from 26.2% in 1996 to 35% in 2021. And as at last year, more than 3.2 million people now own a home with a mortgage, with this cohort being at its strongest in the ACT at 40.2% and Western Australia at 40%. In contrast, in 2016, 2.56 million people owned their home outright, and that rose to 2.87 million people last year. Outright ownership in 2021 was reported in Tasmania at 37.1% and its lowest in the Northern Territory at 15.8%. Now, the Real Estate Institute of Australia President Hayden Grove said that more lending activity is expected in order to achieve the great Australian dream of home ownership. It also reflects the fact that housing affordability is an issue that remains unaddressed by state and federal governments. And the ABS also reported that there'd been an increase in apartments between 2016 and 21 and accounted for almost 31% of total growth in private dwellings. Over 2.5 million people, or 10.3% of Australians, now reportedly live in apartments. And speaking at the 2021 census data release launch, Australian statistician David Gruen said there were a number of interesting patterns in the data over Australian housing, particularly in terms of home ownership and the proportion of people who own their home but have a mortgage. It's gone up quite a lot, Mr. Gruen said, whereas the proportion of people who own their house outright has gone down by a reasonable amount. I have to say that those statements really understate the real situation. But no surprise then that Housing and Homeless Minister Julie Collins said more people have come to her with stories of housing stress in the last 12 months than ever before in her time in Parliament. Collins, who first held the portfolio in the Gillard government in 2013, said Australia's housing challenges have worsened over the intervening years. What's changed significantly is that far too many Australians don't have a place to call home, she said. Australians have found it more difficult to rent a home or more difficult to purchase a home. Clearly, housing affordability in Australia has become a really significant issue, which is why we all need to be working together to try to solve it. And the data extracted from the 2021 and 2001 census by the ABS and analysed by the SMH and the Age showed that 20 years ago, more than 1 in 5 35 to 44-year-olds owned their home outright. But last year, fewer than 1 in 10 in that age group could say the same. And in 2001, 41.4% of people aged between 45 and 54 owned their home outright. But in 2021, just 18.5% of people in that age bracket did. In both those age groups, More than half now have mortgages, while the number of renters have also swelled. Domain chief economist and researcher Nicola Powell said a simple reason more people had mortgages now than 20 years ago was that they have grown as house prices have skyrocketed. We're extending ourselves more. We're taking on bigger mortgages and taking a longer period of time to pay them off, she said. What that means is people are going into their retirement years with part of their mortgage still hanging over them as an expense. Among 55 to 64-year-olds, the proportion of mortgage holders in that age group has more than doubled, rising from 15.5% to 35.9%, and the number of people with a mortgage at retirement age or older has risen from 3.2% to 9.6%. Chris Martin, a senior research fellow at the City Futures Research Centre at the University of New South Wales, said some people are using their housing as security and keeping their mortgages open for other purposes, including buying investment properties. But a large part of the growth in mortgage holders was because house prices have risen, and Martin said successive government policies have helped drive that boom. Martin co-authored a recent report that found state and federal governments have spent more than $20 billion in the last decade on housing assistance through first home buyer grants and similar policies. The general trend is that it goes into higher house prices, he said. And Rate City Research Director Sally Tyndall said the shift away from outright ownership has not emerged overnight, but it will continue unless property prices fall. Higher interest rates are bringing the housing market down, which might help some first home buyers, she said. If we see the property prices drop, as they're forecast to do, we will see that hurdle will be lowered, but it's not going to be a smooth sailing for first-time buyers, she said. And Martin said having a national housing plan with state and federal coordination will be vital. Having a housing policy with the objective that everyone, whether they own or rent, should have affordable, secure housing of a decent standard should be the objective, he said. Well, I do agree with that, but we have really gone off the rails here. Why? Because we've seen property turn from somewhere to live to an investment. This financialization of property is the root cause of the issue. And of course, it's been stimulated by government policy, by ultra-low interest rates, and the banks willing to lend to anyone with a pulse. Now, whether that changes ahead, of course, is an interesting question. Without changes in the fundamental settings, probably not. But it should. But the net result, as I see in my surveys and as the ABS reports, is we have more people with bigger mortgages going into retirement with those mortgages still intact. And we also find that first-time buyers are starting to buy quite a lot later. Indeed, in my latest surveys, we see a much later start date for people getting into the property market at all. But in my view, this whole housing and finance complex is starting to break the back of many Australians. And of course, the bad news is it sucks the air out of the broader economy. Banks lend less for businesses relative to housing than they've ever done. And it also means that people are up to their eyes in debt. And with rising interest rates, they are highly exposed to bigger mortgage repayments and the risks of default. So we have really messed up here in a major fashion over 20 or 30 years. The question now becomes whether, in fact, the government really wants to address the root cause issues, or whether they'll just throw a bit more sticking plaster over the top and hope that things don't get too much worse. This is going to require a significant drive from the community to underscore to the government that what we've got at the moment is unacceptable and it needs to change. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.